Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. We are up to episode 108 today, Friday, June 3rd, 2022. It's getting gorgeous out there. If you're out enjoying the day, I hope you're seeing this in reruns because my goodness, it's getting beautiful in the wonderful state of Michigan. But we have a wonderful show today. It's the last show in our series in partnership with ArborHive entitled The Clinician's Perspective. Early on, you've heard us talk many times about the need to understand your market, to understand your user, to understand the pressures that they're under, If you're building a startup, if you're developing devices or other interventions, you really need to understand who's using it and what their pressures are. And of course, this comes down really to roost inside of hospital systems, talking to doctors and nurses, as well as administrators who really understand what the business and financial and other pressures are on these providers, especially in a COVID and post-COVID world, which has really changed the landscape. So in just a few minutes, our guest today is Frank Sawyer. He's been involved in hospital operations for a long time, and he's going to tell us a lot about those kinds of pressures that we were just talking about. After that, we'll have time for Q&A. But before that, I want to tell you about the next series coming up on MedTech Crossroads. We're calling it De-risking, or De-risking Medical Device Development. And we're going to spend a number of weeks talking in detail about topics related to how do you get the risk out of medical device product development. Because there's no recipe, there's no blueprint, there's no just do this and you'll instantly be a $100 million success. No, it's a matter of moving towards your goal, knocking down the biggest obstacles along the way as you refine your product and you refine your market. And so we'll get into detail on a number of those. This is going to be of interest to startups, entrepreneurs, investors, and many others who want to know, how do I really get the low-hanging fruit and how do I knock down the biggest hurdles as early as possible? So we'll be talking about de-risking starting next week, June 10th. A little bit of local news. The A2 Biosocial is back in person Tuesday, June 14th, 2022, 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. at York in Ann Arbor. They'll be meeting up for food and drinks, sponsored by MyLead Consulting and presented in general by Ann Arbor Spark, MyLead, and Mish Bio. Always thankful for what A2 Biosocial is doing out there. And as we've mentioned and will continue to mention every week, the Michigan Medical Device Summit coming up September 20th, 2022 in Kalamazoo, in person. Looking forward to being there with you for that. It should be a great event. Glad to have that one coming back. And with that, it brings us to our main event. Today, joining me live is Frank Sawyer. Frank, I'm going to find his wonderful bio here, which I've just completely misplaced. Frank, I'm sorry for the snafu. Here, we're going to bring it right back up. Frank is, he's worked for the last 20 years in the healthcare industry. He started as an intern, and it's always a great way to get in on the ground floor, at IU Health's Methodist Hospital, through his current role as a hospital operations executive in the Detroit area. In addition to hospital operations leadership, Frank has experience in physician practice management, public health, and clinical service line strategy development. Frank's areas of focus for the future include the following. He likes leveraging emerging technologies as a vehicle to improve healthcare delivery and patient outcomes. He likes to eliminate healthcare disparities, particularly for people of color. He likes to use design thinking and principles to create a more customer-focused healthcare service that truly puts the patient first. And as we've been having this series in conjunction with ArborHive, Frank, I think your experience is just absolutely phenomenal because you get to see so much that we as folks working in MedTech or we as patients are just completely unaware of. And yet your day-to-day is what's actually making this thing run behind the scenes. So we're really excited to talk with you today. I wonder if you'd give our audience a little bit more of your background. What, all the way from your internship with Methodist Health, Methodist Hospital, all the way through today, how have you gotten to where you are? And the question I always love to ask people, Frank, is at some level, why are you crazy enough to keep coming back and do what you do? It's a very, very hard job to run operations for hospital systems. There's probably a lot of just getting beat up every day, and yet so much impact you can make. I'd like to hear more about why you do it and the personal value you find in it. But give us some of that history.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gene, I'd like to start just by saying thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you and your audience. Really, it's a segment that I'm very passionate about, and thanks to our friends at ArborHive for setting this up. It is a hard job, and I joke that I ask myself why every day, but it's the ecosystem and the opportunity to have an impact that really gets you going, and I'll unpack some of that. So I actually got into the healthcare field by happenstance. I'm a big sports fan. I thought I wanted to do sports administration, and I had a contact in that field who was wise enough to sit me down and say, hey, there's tens of thousands of people that want to do what you want to do and only 100 or so jobs. But let me tell you about it. And the mechanics of the day-to-day actually look a lot like healthcare and hospitals. And healthcare and hospitals are in every city, every country, big, small. Job opportunities are a great thing, So with that, I took that advice and stumbled across an internship opportunity at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, and really from day one fell in love with the environment. It's so dynamic. It's so diverse. The myriad of professions that are there, everybody, obviously, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, architects, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, everything in between, all in one setting. And a large hospital is very much like a city. And if you like managing complex systems, it's very much like that. So once I did that internship, I retooled, my business curriculum and switched all my what should have been fun electives towards healthcare specific electives, and dove off into grad school at WashU in St. Louis. They have a great healthcare administration program, and from there started the career journey. I would say that I got to where I am now, in my 20 years since that internship, really by being willing to learn as much as I can about every facet of the hospital. And people think of the sexy stuff, the surgeries, the cath labs, the ED and trauma programs. And I made my way by doing the dirty work of the projects, assignments, and roles that no one wanted, and took the time to build a resume and a track record of performance that then opened doors for those type of sexy jobs and roles and projects. And what I tell early careerists is be willing to do whatever, but whatever you do, knock it out of the park, and that'll open doors, as you go to progressively more interesting things. And so, part of the why is the challenge. I think many in fields like mine or in the healthcare profession, we're a bit of gluttons for punishment. We're those type of people who want to solve the unsolvable, and won't necessarily give up. But particularly coming out of this COVID season, and as technology in the world changes, I think we're all starting to realize we have to do things vastly differently, which is where the emerging technologies piece really starts to come in. And I think we get to alignment with a lot of the topics you've been covering in this series.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. I was trying to find that quote. I think it was, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it was it Mr. Rogers whose mother told him, look for the helpers in any situation? I get that one wrong, but it strikes me that mentality, I love how you said it, whatever you do, just knock it out of the park. Go find something to do and knock it out of the park. And that seems to be how you've run into this, and now in a managing hospital operations for like you said, a small city. It's absolutely incredible to, and I'm sure you watch your career development and say, wow, this is amazing. I'm responsible for all of this now. In terms of the kinds of things you see day to day, you said something a minute ago. You said architects and mechanical engineers. And even I was caught off guard, because in my day-to-day of thinking about hospitals, I forget that there are these other kinds of roles there, and you're responsible for all of these people and how they work together, orchestrating them. Tell us a little bit more about that diversity of profession that's there. Maybe the places where we're not used to thinking about it, because we think, like you said, about the doctors who are there, we think about the nurses, we think maybe even about the janitors who are there, but there's some roles that we'd never think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And the phrase that comes to mind is it's truly an ecosystem where everything supports everything around it, and one degradation in one area quickly tugs on another and pulls that down. And so we've got the whole fleet of engineers, because we have a vast electrical system, a vast IT system, heavy equipment, boilers, chillers, HVAC that all have to work. Temperatures and pressure relationships and air changes are very, very important from a quality and safety setting standpoint in the hospital setting. We've got, lab, when you think of all the diagnostic work that goes behind the scenes to getting a diagnosis, so lab, radiology, we've got physicists to calibrate and help us understand those machines, those diagnoses. Obviously, we talk about doctors and nurses. Something that's extremely important that people don't often consider until you really need it is food and cleaning. When you think about infection prevention in a hospital, we not only have the infection prevention scientists, but we also have the people that do the cleaning and all the science and rigor that goes behind that. And then on any given day, you have to feed, call it 400 patients plus 1,500 colleagues that work there, plus visitors, et cetera. So even running a kitchen and a food supply operation to feed 3 to 5 meals a day for that big audience becomes very much a logistical undertaking. And then thinking of logistics, I think we've all become acutely aware of supply chain challenges over the past 2 years. Well, think about all of the supplies that you have to get into a hospital every single day to make the machine work, and making sure that, that product that's on a boat coming across the Atlantic hits the port, gets off the boat, through the port, onto the plane, onto the train, to our dock when we need it, just in time for that surgery that your loved one's having. All that is very much an orchestrated dance that has to go right. And behind it are amazingly intelligent people with expertise to make that all work, and undergirding of technology to make it all work. And so sitting in my seat, and we talked, before, I view myself as very much kind of the head air traffic controller to make all this magic work. It's very humbling because you work with people that everyone knows something that you don't know. They all have vast educations and expertise in their field, and your job is to approach it with an open mind, synthesize all of the intelligence that they have, and then design a system that works for them so that they can do their job and be successful.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing, and something I want to come back to a little bit later, Frank, is we've had experiences in our careers where we've noticed that oftentimes innovators will say, "Oh, I'm gonna change something, and I'm gonna make life better," without thinking about all of this infrastructure that's behind it. And there's some dynamics there. There can even be some politics there. There can be jobs on the line that people don't even think this is something I have to deal with. I just want to make the world better through my device, but to understand this world is huge. I love your analogy of head air traffic controller, and I want to sort of take us to this question of how the airport, if you will, operates. Because I think even in a lot of the conversations we've had with folks as a part of this series, many times the discussion can be aspirational, which is good. We should aspire to make cool changes and see large changes come. But oftentimes, aspiring to procedurally change the world isn't what one has the luxury to do at a given moment. When we're sitting there as an air traffic controller, there may be principles, there may be procedures and everything else. But the reason you have an air traffic controller is to make the decisions that have to be made at that moment to make things, so in the case of our analogy, so that airplanes don't run into each other. I imagine your life is a lot like that too. I imagine you spend part of it thinking about how could we make this systemically better so that we don't run into certain problems again. But also I can imagine a lot of it is just making the pieces fit together on any given day. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. I would say that the drive time in is the aspirational time of all the things that I want to accomplish today. And then within the first 10 minutes, all that's out the window. You're spot on. You know, my role and my team's job is to make sure that in the here and now, you know, patients, physicians, and clinicians are able to get the care they need or provide the care they need, and everybody that supports them. So unfortunately, we don't get the luxury of being able to spend a lot of time on the aspirational, here's how I would rebuild or recalibrate, you know, the operation to deliver something materially better. You know, I'll get there, and the first thing we do every day is a situational analysis. What's our patient load? What's our staffing capabilities for the day? Do we have any equipment or technical issues? Are there any, you know, challenges on the horizon that are going to impact our day-to-day? Are there any potential safety issues? And then off you go. And inevitably, you spend a lot of time firefighting issues, because a lot of those questions that I just asked, there's a yes. You know, we've got an electrical issue over here. We've got a weather issue over here that's affecting something within the hospital. We've got more patients than we have staff, you know, to take care of. We've got a backlog over here. And you spend your day working the problems in real time so that actual patients and families and loved ones get what they need immediately. And then at some point, you get to a stable state for the day or the evening, and you go home and you take a deep breath and you think about, how would I do it differently tomorrow and make it better? And then you rinse and repeat the next day with a whole different set of circumstances and variables. And what I love about this work is no 2 days are alike. No 2 days are predictable. Every day it's a new, unique set of challenges and circumstances that you try to address to the best of your ability.
You know, it's really interesting, because one of the successes that we've seen in the world of MedTech development has always come out of a willingness to enter the environment of the people you're trying to serve. And that has often, when it's happened, and I think the sea is shifting over time. People are realizing this need. You'll see teams that will send, oftentimes they're like fellows or things like that, into a hospital system to observe care delivery specifically. But what you're talking about, Frank, sort of opens my eyes up to the idea that if we're innovating on healthcare in general and MedTech in general, part of, if a group is trying to do that kind of sending people in to watch how care is delivered, it actually behooves them to take one step back from that too, and say not just how is it delivered at bedside, but how is it delivered as a system? Because you can't actually dissociate those two. The clinicians are limited by the system or empowered by the system that's around them.
Absolutely. And there are so many links in the chain that you might address the one that you find obvious, but if it doesn't connect to the information system or it doesn't connect to the up or downstream processes, you've solved one problem and created 8 more, which if I'm a developer and innovator, that hinders my ability to get my product into usage and adoption. Because what we're looking for is, how do you make, what I tell folks is, how do you make us better, smarter, faster at delivering care? How do you make it easier and more intuitive for the clinicians to provide care, for those that support them to do what they do, for us to extract the data that we need to demonstrate results? You got to make it easier, not harder. And so you've got to understand, back to that ecosystem word, how your product impacts the ecosystem around what you're trying to do for the better.
And that we've talked about that many times on the show in terms of things like the usability of a product. How does it fit into the workflow? And today our mind is being expanded that this isn't just bedside workflow. This is workflow for the hospital system, where you've got resourcing challenges, you've got infrastructure challenges, we even mentioned weather challenges, right? How do these things all work together? We wanted to talk, Frank, a little bit about some of the problems that when you're on your drive in or your drive home, that you get the chance to sort of think about in healthcare. And as you and I talked before, I think the first one you mentioned was that almost everything in healthcare is manual. Help us understand what that means and what kinds of challenges that causes.
Yeah, honest statement is healthcare and its adoption of technology is decades behind the rest of what we'll call industry in America. And we've spent a lot of time innovating around products in isolation, but not around kind of the whole throughput systemic approach to care delivery. And so there's a lot of individualized, find a set of information, manually key it in, manually extract data points, put it over here, so that someone else can find it. And if you've ever been in an EMR and you talk to clinicians, you'll hear about clicks, number of clicks it takes to find the information I need to make the decision and provide the care. And it's very, very difficult for them. And each individual can find their own pathway. So it's really hard to get to standardization, and without standardization, it's really hard to get to automation. So, we're beginning to talk a lot about how do we leverage automation to decrease the cognitive burden, because there are so many discrete decision points within any caregiver's day that it's virtually impossible for two different caregivers to get to the exact same point given the sheer number of variables placed in front of them. So when I said before, how do we make it easier? That's what I'm talking about, using the computing power of our technology in the modern world to provide more readily usable information and direction for our caregivers, so that that doctor, that nurse, that pharmacist, that respiratory therapist can really just focus on what are the salient things I need to make my clinical decision with reliable outcomes for the patient.
Let's unpack some of that. That's really fascinating, because there's a few comments in there I want to dive in on. One of the things you said is we need standardization before we can get to automation. And I've often, in considering these types of systems that are out there and use of data, makes a lot of sense. And maybe this is getting too technical, but you think about databases and you think about a field in a database and you think about that field in the database because some programming team over here decided that this field's going to mean this and have this, or some caregiver interprets the right thing to plug into that field as this, but it's not actually what the rest of everybody else is thinking. You've now lost the utility of that field at some level, or you've diluted it, or now it doesn't mean what you think it means. And it's as simple as that square in the Excel, I mean, it's not Excel, but the square in the Excel database is not well understood. So I guess, first of all, are we sort of right on the core of that issue there?
Yeah, absolutely. The data has to be findable, usable, and extractable in a way that is intuitive for the people who need the information. And, in our EMR conversations, the EMR builder would say, hey, it's in there. But if the user can't find it, can't get to it, or can't interpret it, it's effectively useless. And if when you go to extract the data that you use to validate what you're doing is working, if you can't prove it because you can't get to the right data because it's not in the right place, that data point is also effectively useless.
Frank, I want to dive in even a little bit deeper on that, because I think for those who are involved, especially in digital health and things like that, this is actually a really, really interesting question to get a little bit deeper on. And maybe in your drives home, you've had some thoughts about how this could be made better. But it's one that has come up enough times that I think it's worth diving in slightly on. One of the challenges that we have, especially in the world of device development, is if you have an issue, a risk, standard practice is that the best thing is to make the design safe inherently. And if you can't achieve that, then you at least put safety factors on it. And if you can't do that, the last-ditch effort is you put it in the instructions. But of course, we know no one actually reads the instructions. So we can imagine a world where to get the right data in the right places, we could write long instruction books and train everybody. But the problem is nobody actually has time for that, and only half the people are going to pay attention anyways at some level. Some of it could be better clarity on the part of those who are writing custom front ends for EMRs. How do you see problems like that getting resolved? I love your comment that standardization has to happen before automation. I don't know if I've heard such a clear statement about that ever before, but I think it's spot on. Do you have any thoughts as to how standardization can happen? Because there's even beyond that, like within clinical practice, there will be variation, right? I mean, clinicians are going to have slightly different, but we're not even talking about their variation. We're just talking about two clinicians who have a similar persuasion and a similar practice aren't even going to come to the same conclusions because they're looking at data not in the same way, and the data is not even the same for them. What are some ways that this could? How do we get to standardization? Forget about automation.
Yeah, I think this is where you have to, and this may seem obvious, but you have to involve a wide range of end users in your design. Design thinking. Think about the customer and the user at the beginning to get to the end, and understand what is it they're trying to do and achieve, and what are their thought processes on how they get to, from A to Z, and then design your product to help facilitate that. And a great example that so many of us have are the smartphones. We have them, we know how to navigate them. The hundreds of millions of people are all very different and think very different. And yet, if you hand us a smartphone, we know how to navigate and get to the exact same solution because they're designed intuitively based on what we need. And so I think partnering with whomever your customer is on the front end and really spending the work on how to make it intuitive leads to kind of that herd all using it in the same fashion to get to, reliable outcomes, usage, and data points. I have no idea how you do that. You have design experts who do all that for you in the tech space, as that's their expertise. But I think we need to go more in that direction when we're designing healthcare applications and tools and technologies to help us do this better.
I think there's a huge amount that user interface can do. We've got some friends who's had a family member in a hospital system, and they knew more about the EMR than the nurses on shift did, and they knew where the contraindications were listed in the EMR and had to show the care staff where to find them. And so that's a user interface question, right? Like that's a matter of, like you said, we know how to use a cell phone, we know how to hit the send button. Those systems should be designed at least that intuitively if we've got people's lives on the line. That's a great one. Is there a deeper issue, though, that's sort of like if we use cell phones as our example, where, if you and a friend are texting back and forth and it's kind of going rapid fire in the heat of whatever's happening, and there's a misunderstanding, and you knew what you meant, and your friend thinks that you meant something else, then you spend the next 5 minutes kind of trying to sort that out and say, no, that's not what I meant. Is there a feedback loop? I mean, if it's you and me and we want a relationship and we're having a text stream, we're gonna work it out till we get to the bottom of it. But if we're just plugging data into a system, is there also that kind of element of is there a feedback loop that corrects what got entered as opposed to the user interface of how it got entered?
Right. From what I've seen currently, no. You're able to put in hard stops potentially for things that I would conjecture don't make sense. But I think that's really where we get to the future of artificial intelligence within the EMR and other systems that basically say, hey, with probability, your answer should be within this realm. And if yours isn't, look over here, if not straight to the place of taking all the inputs and telling you the answer for you. Additionally, I think, because clinicians and caregivers have so much training and so much expertise, but there's also so much noise, that how do we clean out the noise so that their brain power can be focused on the most critical aspects of the decisions. And then where there's discrepancy, they actually have time and clarity around, let's have the back and forth in the debate, versus I'm dealing with so much input, much of which isn't useful. It just clouds the environment and pulls me away from being able to have those critical discussions and debates to get to the right answer. So short answer, AI, cut out the noise so that you can have more clarity and more focus on that, which is important.
That's great. I hear 2 points in there. One is that there's not the time in the care workflow for the clinicians to be having that 5-minute dialogue that you and I might have if we're friends trying to resolve an ambiguity in our relationship. And so then start to look for places where, yeah, you know what, if we've got fields that should have a meaning, should have a value, and there is an understood range, then we can at least disambiguate whether somebody plugged the wrong value into the wrong field at that point. I think that's a really interesting point. You know, as long as we're talking about EMRs, you made a very, very interesting point to me about how EMRs are used, and again, electronic medical records, EMRs, right? It's supposedly the replacement for the paper-based system. But you have some really interesting observations on how they're used versus how they were designed.
Yeah, my observation, of 14 years of being in an EMR shop and going through multiple go lives is people think that the EMR is an engine for operations and innovation and clarity. And really, it's a data repository. It's an electronic journal that keeps information, but largely intelligently doesn't do a lot on its own. And when you look at it thinking that it's gonna drive operations when it's not built to do that, you run into a lot of problems. And so this is, again, where the EMR has to be built from the nurse's perspective, from the operator's, I'm an operator in this example, an operator's perspective, or any of the user's perspective. And it's historically been designed trying to plug these silos in, but without a full understanding of how will a person run the relay race longitudinally through the EMR to get to the outcome they need. And so I think there's a gap in our design. There's an emerging market of apps that plug into the EMR to facilitate. But the analogy that I'll give you that we talked about a little bit, not to get back to the smartphone, but the EMR is the iPhone. And the functionality that we need are all the apps that attach to it. It's absolutely the undergirding that you need to drive usability, and happiness in this example from a care delivery standpoint, but you need all the apps. The apps are what make your iPhone the iPhone, in terms of your day-to-day life and necessity, not the actual brick itself. But without the brick, you can't have the apps. And so getting to a state where, okay, now that the EMRs are widely accepted, how do we truly make them usable and functional for what we're trying to achieve as a patient, as a doctor, as a pharmacist, as a lab tech? Housekeepers use the EMR also, so do the workflows, do you have all the attachments that are needed? And then from a business standpoint, does it work for me in terms of driving the outcomes and performance measures that we need to make the hospital healthy and successful as well?
Do you, and this is complete conjecture, right? But do you think that when you talk about the EMR as a smartphone, or maybe we might even say like an operating system upon which apps and applications can run and plug into, do you think that this is something that the, personal opinion here, like the Epics and Cerners of the world and others who make these things, is this something that they are going to achieve the level of functionality that we would hope for by sort of, and I think a lot of times the code for a given hospital system, correct me if I'm wrong, is written sort of custom for that hospital system as kind of a front end. Are we going to get there through front-ending EMRs, or is this something where there needs to be a sort of a standardization layer that happens more to your analogy of I can go out there and I can write an app for iOS, the Apple operating system.
Mm-hmm.
I can go out there, I can write an app for Android. I can go out there and I can contribute in a way that then has a native plug with the system. So I guess just a sort of personal gut feel, do you think that these systems by themselves are going to reach the level of functionality, or do you think a revolution needs to come where an interface layer happens and then sort of workflow gets written by others?
That is the $10 million question, and there are so many capitalistic market factors embedded in that question and in that prediction. But what I think will happen is over the next, call it 5 to 10 years, folks in roles like mine will come to demand it because the base EMR doesn't give us the capabilities we need to run the systems and processes we need to provide the care that the community expects. And that is the market pressure that will either push the EMR companies to expedite their rate of development, or will allow, app companies, in this example, software developers within the healthcare space, to really kick in the door and be able to do, and implement and bring to adoption the type of things that could do it from the outside in. So I do think we are very much at the inflection points, because EMRs have been around long enough where people are pretty comfortable with what they can and can't do. And the large EMR companies are rapidly moving to develop these solutions internally. And they're in a race with, Silicon Valley companies that are trying to do the same as well in the startup world.
And I suppose how democratized that interface layer becomes says a lot about how successful that'll be, because the EMRs now have that beachhead, they have that niche in the hospital system. So you're not going to displace them. You have to either work with them or not work with them.
Correct.
Now, that's fascinating. Well, I think this is an insight we've not had before into how these systems actually get used. The point that you made here, that we need to be able to take that raw data, we need to be able to use it, we need to be able to all interpret it as clinicians, similarly, to get the same kinds of results out of it. You pointed out to me, and I really resonated with this, as in recent years, the parent of a child who was in the hospital. I think your words were, "What's the plan, man?" And it really focused for me how these kinds of challenges with clinicians understanding each other through the commonality of their infrastructure, of the EMR, actually causes these challenges that then emerge as us not understanding where we're going with care. Tell us about how that manifests itself and how you try to solve that.
Yeah, to take, your example, so you're in the hospital, and if you took the time to notice all the different people that in some way, shape, or form, touched your loved one, were a part of the care process, and how you stitch together all of that information that goes into a pot to get to a clinical decision and a plan. And, at the end of the day, you need some person that is synthesizing all of that and then making it into the direction that is then shared up and down the care chain, and then with you and involving you in the process. And that sounds easy, but it's very, very complex, because your stay, might be 5 days. And each of those functions, they might have an 8-hour shift or a 12-hour shift. And so on a 24-hour cycle for each day, you've got 2 of everybody, 2 times 10 times however many days, all those different people are providing care. And you hope that, think of it in terms of a game of telephone. Okay, we've now got 60 people in this game of telephone, hoping you get to the end and your loved one is communicated perfectly. And so back to the technology, shepherding all of that along so you get to a consistent and clear answer, ideally speaking, that you can access yourself And so you know where to ask questions and points of clarification, and having that dialogue and being that check and balance. But it's enormously complex, and candidly, I don't know that there's a way to do it well, reliably, without better technology. Just because at any point there can be a communication or an understanding breakdown in the process.
And that gets used both to communicate to the patient as well as to communicate to, for example, the next shift, like you were saying a minute ago, that it ends up serving two purposes there.
Absolutely.
Well, this brings us to a really interesting point, Frank, which is, we talk a lot on the show about who the customer is, about understanding your customer. You shook my world up again too, because you said that a lot of times, I don't know if it's healthcare systems. I'll let you phrase it how you think it best. But a lot of times people think that the doctor is the customer, and that you have some challenges to that way of thinking.
Yeah, and it's complex and confusing. But historically, the industry has been designed around the physician first, and then other caregivers off of that, when in reality, the end customer is the patient. The patient should be driving the whole process. What are your expectations? What are your needs? What are your desired outcomes? How do we design all of this to help you get to whatever end goal is that you want, not what we've decided is the best end goal for you. And so how we define success is based on all these measures that are about the clinician and the doctor, and not about the patient, who is the customer. And it's really kind of interesting and confounding, because I think the question I pose to you is, think about another industry, major industry, that's less oriented around its primary customer than healthcare. And until we shift that paradigm, I think we're going to continue to struggle. And then there's a pesky third customer in the mix as well for, folks in your audience, and it's the hospital or health system. Because at the end of the day, the thing that you're trying to introduce your product or service or technology to, your customer in this instance is who's writing the check, and who is going to be the one that's making the purchasing decision or the go, no-go implementation decision. And so, you have to both design a system and process around serving your patient. Your customer is also the user, i.e. the clinician, and then the approver, which is, the administrator that has to fund the activity. And so finding that sweet spot that aligns all three of those aims is really the end objective. And I think where we see, innovation stall is they address one, but not two, and definitely not with all three in mind. And the ones that do figure that out are usually the ones that have the best chance for success.
Wow, it is a paradigm shift, right? That's a massive change, not just in any given hospital system, but in terms of how the industry has tended to think over the years. I actually want to direct you in on a subset of that question, but I also want to mention to our audience, if you have any questions for Frank, please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the Q&A box. We'd be happy to get those to Frank. It's just such a valuable resource here. We don't often get to talk to somebody who is running the day-to-day of a hospital system. It's just an absolutely fascinating place you are. And Frank, take a moment here too to thank you, because I bet your work largely goes unheralded and unsung, but without it, we would have the analog of airplanes crashing into each other. So thank you for what you do. We appreciate it. I want to dive you.
Happy to help.
Oh, it's amazing. I want to dive you into this. I had a misperception, frankly, when you and I were talking the other day. I think I'm stuck in the paradigm of there's a right outcome from this interaction with a healthcare provider, and I was always raised to be a bad patient, to advocate for myself, to try to work hard, to try to come up with the ideal outcome. And we've heard on other shows from clinicians about how challenging it can be to do things like training and follow up with patients and to get them to take part. And even all that does further this narrative that the right outcome is a given outcome. And you sort of disabused me of that, and I really appreciate it. There's a different way to think about outcomes and how we can get to where we can get to with a given patient. How do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gets back to those consumer principles and design thinking principles of every single one of us has our own innate objectives for whatever we do. And we have to ask first, what is it that you want? And what are you willing to do to achieve that? And if what you want and what you're willing to do is misaligned with what I want for your outcomes, then the responsibility is on me to realign with that of the customers. We joked about cars, and if I'm the customer and I want a comfortable ride and a great stereo going to work, and you want high performance and cornering, and you sell me that car, I'm not a very happy customer. Similarly, if I want to, achieve a certain health outcome, but your outcome, I want to be able to live and move and eat the foods I want to eat and spend time the way I want to spend time. And your outcomes mean I can't do the activities that I love. I can't eat the food I want. I can't go visit who I want to visit. I'm never going to do that. And so you have to adjust your expectations of me, because at the end of the day, it's my life. It's my free will. I'm not a quality metric on your scorecard. I'm a person who wants to live life as I see fit. That's really hard for us in our field. We're evaluated and judged by our macro outcomes. We're incentivized based on our macro outcomes, not, taking each individual patient at their word and at their will. But if we're going to build a system that works, at the end of the day, we've got to have those customers in mind first, and let them tell us what success is for them. And what we're finding is, as consumerism takes hold, as people have more access to information, as people are starting to take on more of the financial burden of their own care, they want more say. And, therein lies the rub that is coming within our industry.
It's really interesting. That puts a focus on perhaps a different way of phrasing the distinction between population health and personal health, and how those two are not always 100% in sync.
Absolutely.
It struck me over the years, just my own personal observation, that oftentimes clinicians, they see sometimes like the worst of the worst, right? They see a lot of people who are in need, and so they see what is perhaps in some ways, this is just my perception, so that I'm not going to the bank on this one, but they see what is almost an unnatural cross-section of all of civilization. It's the people who are sick and in need of care. And it's very reasonable to form your own mental opinion about how this should, like, hey, we could fix your personal health and we could fix the population health if I could just get this to happen right now. And I don't think you're saying, oh, clinicians shouldn't have a vision for how care should be delivered, but at the same time saying that's not inherently listening to the person who's in front of you.
Right. Yeah, I think our job in, the perfect sense would be, we have the ability to provide the information to individuals. The individual has access to the interventions as they see fit, and then we let them decide. The challenges often in our current health system are we don't get information to the right people at the right time in a way that is usable for them. And then we have access issues as well. So depending on where you are, who you are, you might have the information, you might want the care, but then you can't get to it. The things we can control are access and information, and then let folks make their own decision, because, it didn't take long in public health for me to realize that, You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And that's human nature. We can make this available for you, but we can't make you take it if you don't want to. I mean, heck, that's a synopsis of the past year post-vaccine is, here it is. We tried to force people to take it in a lot of applications. We saw how that went. So it just healthcare doesn't work that way as much as we'd want it to. And I think the example we were joking about is I could say, I want perfect chiseled abs. As a physician, you could say, okay, are you willing to eat correctly and exercise 6 days a week? No. Okay, well, you're not going to get your chiseled abs. So let's talk about what you're willing to do and the outcome that can get you, so you can get the best outcome for what you're willing to do. That's success from the consumer, from the patient's eyes. And so we just have to shift. It's a goal orientation, and then design a system and process that allows us to meet those goals.
Well, like so many things, it strikes me as a communications challenge too, to come to the same page. Because if you're a clinician and you think a better outcome is achievable, sounds like we're advocating for letting the patient know what outcomes are achievable with different levels of action or activity on their part, and then letting them make the decision as to how they want to live their life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, in the last few minutes we have together, Frank, I want to go to kind of how this all comes together. And to talk about how it all comes together, we have to talk about the labor shortages in healthcare.
Right.
Now, I think people have gone back and forth on this, quote, great resignation in society as a whole, and said, well, maybe it's not quite as much of a long-term effect as we've seen. But I think in healthcare it is. I think it's pretty well documented that healthcare systems are seeing massive retirements, as you pointed out to me the other day, and other challenges of retaining staff. What's going on behind the scenes there? Why do we see that?
Yeah, one, it is a very challenging line of work for all the reasons we spoke about. Additionally, the manual nature of the work means it's literally laborious. It's physically hard on people to do. Our pipelines have decreased. When you think about the amount of doctors and nurses and technical specialists that educational institutions are churning out, they can't keep up with the demand. So the folks that are in the field are having to work harder than ever because we don't have enough staff to provide, for all the demand that we have. As you hit on with the pandemic, I think anybody that could retire did. People that weren't fully certain that they were willing to take the risk of being in the field left the field. So we're sitting here, some of the industry data I've seen is 15 to 20% below what we were before the pandemic, trying to manage an ever-increasing population of people and take care of them. And so for me, in the executive operations space, our number one challenge is how are we going to get the job done with fewer and fewer human resources available to us? And the answer to that can only be innovation, automation, making it easier for the people that are here to do the work, making it more reliable through use of technology. It's interesting because, various industries, some get to this place because it's financially incentivized. Others get to this place out of necessity, and I would say where healthcare is headed is just out of sheer survival and necessity. We're going to have to begin to do things and leverage technology in a vastly different fashion because we've got a population that is going to continue to, get sick, have traumas, age, chronic disease, births, that whole thing. It's a field that's not going anywhere. We're going to have to perpetually take care of people, and we're just going to have to think of a much more efficient way to do it in a world where we have not enough caregivers and technical specialists to do it in the old way. And so that's where we look at companies to say, let's partner, let's figure this out together. If we can help you build better technologies and tools, back to where I started, ecosystem, we simply introduce new players into the ecosystem and we all adapt and we hopefully get to a place where we all can thrive.
Well, this has been incredible, Frank. It's interesting. We should mention that, whenever we're talking with any of our, especially in this ArborHive series, with any of our clinicians, they're speaking in their personal capacity, not in any professional one with any particular healthcare system. But I got to say, I wish we could name healthcare systems, because I would love to come to the place where you are overseeing these things, because it actually is very reassuring. Even though there are challenges, right? Even though there are things out there that are big challenges, to know that there are people like yourself who are behind the scenes wrestling with these kind of questions and trying on a day-to-day basis to deliver good care and to enable your teams to deliver good care. It's actually just really reassuring and heartening, even with all the people who've left the healthcare industry, to see you there doing that kind of work, Frank. It's really encouraging. So it actually restores. Even though we're talking today about problems, it actually restores my faith in the people working in our healthcare systems. And I just once again thank you for what you do and for being willing to share some of that story with us.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. And if I could just say that the folks that work in our industry and at our hospital in particular, just the intelligence, the caring, the dedication to trying to deliver care and make care better, is really awe-inspiring and humbling every day. And so I view my job and jobs like mine is to figure out how to make their jobs easier and get them what they need so they can work the magic that I'm not trained to do and I'm not smart enough to do, honestly. Just they're great people who are trying their best to deliver care and make things better. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and we're thankful to them and thankful for all who are staying there. Well, with that, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank my guest, Frank Sawyer, for being with us today. That brings our series in partnership with ArborHive of the Clinician's Perspective to a close. Frank, thank you for leading us through that discussion today. I'm going to leave you with the last word as we bring this series to a close, and as we have one more word from somebody involved in the delivery of healthcare. Where would you like to leave our thoughts?
Yeah, I think, here in our healthcare system, the future is definitely achievable. I think we've got to partner with folks from all over the industry to bring that next level of innovation and creativity to provide the care that folks need. So looking forward to seeing where that goes and partnering with listeners that you have on how to develop what that is. So thank you to everybody who's spent the hour with us today. Hope you're able to get out and enjoy some of the great weather and spend some time with your family and loved ones and just take care. So thank you again for having me.
Frank Sawyer, thank you so much. And thank you all for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. We'll see you next week as we start to talk about medical device development de-risking. Join us next week, Friday. Talk soon. Bye-bye.